So today we're here with Professor John Médaille. I was first introduced to him, it was after the 2016 election. It was January of 2017, and I was pretty frustrated with the political, everything at that point. And I started really diving into Catholic social teaching, and I picked up John's book, Toward a Truly Free Market. And that was the first time where I was presented with I think, a pretty compelling critique of modern American capitalism from a Catholic perspective. And I've been following him on social media since then. We had some really great online discussions, small group discussions after the Pope's encyclical Fratelli Tutti came out. So I'm very excited to be talking with John today.
Thank you.
Welcome, John. Good to have you. Alrighty, well, welcome, dear listeners and watchers, to the Pope Francis Generation. It's the show for Catholics struggling with the Church's teaching, who feel like they might not belong in the Church anymore, and who still hunger for a God of love and goodness.
Your hosts are me, Paul Fahey, a professional catechist.
And I'm Dominic, someone who needs catechesis. Together, we're taking our own look at the Catholic Church, her teachings and practices from three views that changed our world.
And those are the Kerygma, the Doctrine of Theosis, and the teachings of Pope Francis.
Together with you, we're the Pope Francis Generation. Welcome, John. It's good to have you here. I have not met you before tonight. As I said before the call, I will mostly be listening in to you and Paul go at it with a Catholic critique of capitalism. So, Paul, take it away.
Yeah, so as far as an introduction, John currently teaches at the University of Dallas. He teaches Catholic social teaching to business students, and before that he was in the business world for 40 years. He's the author of, John, you said 3 books, correct?
Yes.
I've only read one of them, Toward a Truly Free Market. I know you wrote a textbook, correct?
The textbook, is The Vocation of Business, Social Justice in the Marketplace. And then last year I had a debate with my good friend Thomas Stork, and that was mostly on theology, history, and philosophy, and art, actually, and where those things are rooted. So that was on a little different tack.
That's cool. I wanted to ask to start off, how did you end up teaching Catholic social teaching? In my experience, it's a little bit of a niche corner of the Catholic world, unfortunately. So what brought you to liking Catholic social teaching enough to teach it at university?
Well, it was, like all really good things, it was completely accidental. I was working as a real estate agent and making very good money, but it was probably the most boring work I've ever done. And so I decided to take a master's degree in theology at the University of Dallas, for no particular reason.
As one does, yeah.
Yeah, as one does, yes. And while I was there, this just happened to be at the moment that they were establishing their undergraduate business course. And and they wanted their business students to learn Catholic social teaching. However, they wanted it to be taught by a businessman, but they didn't pay enough to hire a real businessman. So since I was taking a master's degree, they asked me, and I was in business, they asked me to put the course together. Well, I naively said yes. I was completely naive because I thought, well, I'd just pick up the textbook and teach it. I mean, any idiot could do that. And I found out, to my utter amazement, that there really was no textbook for Catholic social teaching directed at business students. There were texts for philosophers and theologians and even economists. And there were texts, of course, on the ubiquitous business ethics, which, let's not go there. But no course really on explaining the social encyclicals to business students. So I had to write my own textbook, and that's how my life of crime began. Yes.
Yeah, that's been my experience in the church as well. There's very few already written programs or texts that do what I want them to do, so I end up just making my own thing. Was it was it Peter Kraft, who's written probably more books than I can count? He said something like, I have an idea and I wish someone would have written something about it, and I end up being that person.
And Peter's on the book of the book of the month club. So, yeah.
So that's how you stumbled into Catholic social teaching. I assume that you kind of, if you wrote a textbook about it, I assume you kind of fell in love with it.
Well, I did actually. I mean, I had a little background in it, but I had never worked in it seriously. But in extensive research, and you have to go into economics very deeply to make a reasonable case for Catholic social teaching. If it's divorced from economic order, then you really can't make a convincing argument for it. And in my course and in my text, I always concentrate on the practical aspects. You know, a principle without a practice is, well, a waste of time, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, so...
Wishful thinking.
Yes, exactly. And
So, quick question for you. In my understanding of like Catholic social ethics and so on, and this being the First World West, why is it that nothing has been put together, as you've said to date, for business-minded people? Since the impression that I'm getting, they're primarily the kinds of people in the First World West who are most motivated, or the ones who are tasked with implementing a lot of this stuff. And of course, we have no idea about it. I'm just trying to understand the context. Like, how has nothing been done and it's all primarily stayed in academia?
Sure. Well, the answer is very simple. There's no market for it. I mean, we are the only university that I know of that requires their business students to take this course. And I'm sure if it wasn't a required course, very few of my students would voluntarily walk in the door. Okay, this is, and you can understand that perfectly. So this is, not only it's not only a teaching assignment, it's a sales job, because they come in somewhat skeptical. It's not accounting, it's not operations management, it's not marketing, it's, what the hell is it?
How do your students respond to it?
Judging from my student reviews, they respond very well. This is all new to them, to most of them. They've never heard it before, but they're hungry for it. Okay? Now, I always get one or two who say, he's too hard on capitalism. And of course, they are absolutely right. So can't dispute what they say, but the overwhelming majority find this a very useful course, and that, to me, that warms an old man's heart. I can tell you that.
Yeah, I've heard commentary on this, and it's been my experience as well that the millennial generation and now Gen Z, with younger generation, have a very strong sense of social justice overall as a generation. Would that be your assessment as well? And I imagine how that impacts their readiness to learn about Catholic social teaching.
Well, I noticed a real change in the student body after the collapse of 2008. Now remember, this is a Catholic liberal arts college, but the audience tends to be homogenous. Less so today, but generally you're going to get people with a Catholic background, but very, very conservative and very, very suspicious of even the term social justice.
Yeah.
Which, again, that's understandable too, because the term has, shall we say, become rather plastic. So I think before 2008, they were a lot more suspicious. And of course, it took me some time to develop my own skills as a teacher. Yeah. But after 2008, it was much more acceptable to question the bases of capitalism. I mean, this had been a traumatic experience for their parents. And so even today, many years later, we're still living with that.
Yeah. So this is a good jumping off point. So not to make you summarize your entire book, But yeah, let's jump into that.
And this is probably where our show is going to go, but I really want to know, how do you sell it then? Like you said, this is now an exercise in marketing. So what, maybe there's a segue too. How do you inspire or convince them that this is not just necessary, but desirable?
One word, praxis. You know, if you can show them a theory and a practice together, which is what I'm calling praxis, that's very interesting to them. So instead of just preaching at them, this is what you should do, you know, this is how it's done. Well, we can look at this. We can look at Mondragon. We can look at Semco. We can look at land distribution in Taiwan, say. We can look at these things, and okay, this is at least doable. And that then, and I think because they are mainly good kids, Catholic kids, or at least amenable to Catholic, they're not all Catholic by any means, but at least amenable to Catholicism, that becomes something that interests them. So they come in because they have no choice, but I think they gain a certain enthusiasm for the topic as we go on.
That's awesome. So yeah, for the bulk of the discussion, we want to talk about what is a Catholic critique of capitalism, or at least capitalism as we see it in the U.S. today. So you can start on whatever point you'd like, but let's jump in.
Well, let's jump in at this point, and that is to go back. I think it becomes clearer if you go back to the original name for capitalism, which was liberalism. Okay, so capitalism was not a term they used. Capitalism was the term used by Marx to denigrate the liberals. And capitalist meant a person who cared more about dead matter than the living worker. That was Marx's meaning for it. Well, liberalism dominated England since 1832 and America since 1870. But it began to fall into disrepute with the Long Depression of 1873, which I think that lasted 5 years, but it really lasted on and off until 1932. And by the crash of 29, the public's confidence in a pure capitalism had just collapsed. And the capitalists responded, the liberals responded, so to say that better, their confidence in liberalism had collapsed. The liberals responded by repackaging themselves as capitalists, which now became the content of conservatism. So conservative and liberal changed places. And this is, you know, when you think about the history, this has somewhat corrupted the discussion, because if you get away from certain issues like sexual issues, the liberals are more conservative than the conservatives, and the conservatives are far more liberal economically than the liberals. So.
Yeah. Is it fair to say, or is it an oversimplification to say that contemporary libertarianism is close to the original liberalism?
It was the original liberalism, yes. It was the original liberalism. So Manchester liberalism, I always thought that the perfect symbol for the confusion today was when Russell Kirk put Edmund Burke at the head of modern conservatism. Now, Edmund Burke was perhaps the leading Manchester liberal of his day. And so, and I have great respect for Russell Kirk, don't get me wrong, but I feel that the irony of that whole situation, Edmund Burke, seriously?
It seems to me And I know of Russell Kirk, and I visited his estate up in Michigan one time when I was an undergrad. But that's about all I know. I haven't read The Conservative Mind, but it seems to me that at least in the ideals of conservatism, there is how does Chesterton put it? Like a respect for and a democracy of the dead. Right? There's a sense of solidarity with what's come before. Mm-hmm. And to me, a libertarianism would deny that solidarity. It would emphasize the individual so much that it would disconnect a contemporary individual from their tradition and their past. Is that a fair critique?
I think it's an excellent critique, because what is this break with this radical break with the past was the whole essence of 19th century liberalism. Everybody else had been stupid up till now, and that really began the century before, the 18th century, with this confidence, total confidence in science. Go back to Newton, and it was Alexander Pope. Newton, of course, solved by a few simple equations these problems that had perplexed astronomy, since the days of Ptolemy. And so, but he resolved it with these simple laws. So Alexander Pope, a Catholic, said, "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." Smith was trying to do for economics what Newton had done for physics, okay, and trying to find the simple laws which move our stars around, our economic stars around.
Yeah, now, I really enjoyed your book. I haven't read it front to back since 2017. So, but I remember in there, you had a pretty strong critique of viewing economics as a hard science, and you proposed a different way of looking at the economy.
Well, I think the proper division of the sciences, we divide them into the physical and normative sciences, and with really only the physical sciences being considered real science, But that is not true. Every science is normative because it has to be normed to a higher truth that comes from a higher science. The real division for me is physical and humane sciences. Physical sciences deal with relationships between physical objects. The humane sciences deal with relationships between human beings and their various systems, social, political, economic systems. And so economics is a science, but it's not a physical science. It's a humane science. And that's leads to a completely different set of assumptions and a completely different set of standards of judgment.
Yeah, and I haven't studied economics, but when I talk with people about economics, they tend to speak about the principles of economics the way that we talk about the principles, Newton's principles of physics, that these are constant and unchangeable, and to even question them, they look at you like you're saying that the sun revolves around the earth.
Yes, that's exactly. Because you can't change economics. It's fixed. It's just like gravity. It's like the inverse square law. But of course, this is simply not true.
So, to kind of dive in to some of the philosophy of it, economics being a humane science then has to have a particular anthropology. It has to have an understanding of the human person. And Catholic social teaching spells out a pretty robust but a pretty specific understanding of the human person. What would be a capitalist anthropology, a capitalist understanding of the human person?
Well, I think this was made very, very explicit by Ludwig von Mises in his book, Having a Senior Moment. What's Mises' major work? But in any case, he... oh, what's wrong with me? I can't remember Ludwig von Mises.
I'm seeing if I can pull it up on
his magnum opus, the
Human Action.
Human Action. Thank you. Human Action. But the subtitle, I mean, it's 944 pages long, but the subtitle tells you all you need to know. A treatise on economics. That is to say, all human action was resolved by self-interest economically. So economics was the boss science for the humanities. Economics and this self-interest tells you everything you need to know about human action. And he goes on for 944 pages like that, all to make that point of his subtitle, A Treatise on Economics. So that's the extreme case of the anthropology of capitalism. Now, they try to soften it. Smith tried to... it really... The best exemplar of it was Bernard de Mandeville's The Fable of the Bees. And in The Fable of the Bees, de Mandeville changed the world because up until that time, from Aristotle through Aquinas and right into the 18th century, virtue was the foundation of economic order. But Bernard de Mandeville posited that vice and vice alone, made economic order, and that virtue was the enemy of economic order. When the hive becomes virtuous, it collapses. Okay, people don't spend enough. They don't waste enough money to provide the jobs for everybody. So without this vice, without this acquisitiveness, without this competition viewed as a war of all against all, you couldn't have a proper economic order. That's been the implicit rule of economics since the 18th century. Now, Smith will try to soften that into, soften his greed into mere self-interest, which can be viewed benignly. So Smith really is in dialogue with de Mandeville. It's somewhat successfully, I think, but he still has to deal with that problem of that anthropology that is strictly vicious.
And I know nothing about de Mandeville, but was he? I'd be interested in what his religious tradition is, because it seems almost to approach the human person as completely fallen or depraved without the capacity for virtue.
Yeah, I don't know de Mandeville's tradition, or that it mattered to him. I would imagine, I would not be surprised to find that some sort of Presbyterian total depravity is in there somewhere. Yeah, but the real theophany, therefore, that view comes from Malthus. Now, Malthus viewed poverty and starvation and those things as just a working out of God's will for the poor, who were, had too many children, and if they couldn't find sustenance, well, they just die. And that's God's will. That's how God disciplines the poor. And he's quite explicit about this being God's will. See, that's his Newtonian principle. So the law of what he calls the law of population, which, by the way, is total nonsense, but the iron law of wages, that's God's will.
So that sounds. I'm currently in a master's program for mental health counseling, and in one of my courses, we're doing a very, very brief survey of critical race theory. And one of the main critiques that critical race theory has is that of capitalism is the idea of a meritocracy, that if you are wealthy and prosperous and have privilege and power, it's because you've earned it. And if you don't have those things, it's because your own lack of willpower, or et cetera. And I see this, that meritocracy present in the culture, but it instantly reminded me of the prosperity gospel and the way that we, even Christians, use the language of, someone has a nice house and we say, the Lord's blessed them with this nice house, or the Lord's blessed them with this nice vehicle. And implicit in statements like that is this idea that God blesses the people he favors with material prosperity. But then behind that then is, if you don't have material prosperity, then God must not be blessing you, right, which is the exact opposite of the message of Jesus, which is, from the lips of Mary at the Magnificat, the poor will be raised up and the rich will be cast down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We preach that, we say that on the one hand, and then we also venerate the saints on the other hand. Most of the saints are the ones who had absolutely nothing. And we say, this is how you should be. God bless you for having lots of stuff over there. John, I do want to come back and ask a quick question about something when you made this one point, which has riveted me about, I forget the name of the person who said the engine of the economy is vice and not virtue, sort of supplanting that ancient code of ethics. So if greed is good and, this sort of desire for the self and whatever, my tribe versus your tribe and everything that comes from that, if that is what is necessary for the economy to function, then I guess I don't understand then what did he see as, and here's me trying to be erudite, the telos of an economy, the end goal, like why does it happen at all? Why is it necessary at all if vice needs to be the thing that animates it? Is that a coherent question?
That's a great question. It's the right word, telos. What is the end or purpose of an economy? And people like de Mandeville would say it's to get rich. It's to get its individual wealth, or if you're a mercantilist, it's the wealth of your country. That's it.
That's the pole star.
That's right. And its measures are entirely quantitative. So the more stuff, the more successful the economy is. So stuff, the multiplication of stuff is the only telos for an economy, which is not a rational economy at all. It's the opposite of a rational economy.
And it's the opposite of, so in Catholic social thought, it's the common good. It's does everyone in that society have the basics for survival, not how wealthy are the wealthy people.
Yes, the telos, at least as I teach it, is the building up, is providing the material base for the family and the community. And so the measure is not quantitative, but qualitative. So our families stronger, our communities stronger. We've reversed this. Communities have just become disposable. Look, I know your town has survived on steel forever, but we really can do this cheaper in Bangladesh. So your town, boop, goodbye. There was an interesting article in National Review. I thought it was very, very revealing. And I forget the author's name, but he was saying that, there was this talk about what we did for, the question was what you did for these communities that were collapsing, and I think it was upstate New York. And his answer was, get them a U-Haul so they can move someplace else. And that was so much for community. It's disposable. It's completely disposable. That was a National Review, which is supposed to be the bastion of conservatism, but is really the bastion of liberalism.
Yeah.
And you see the reversal that's taken place.
Yeah, I wanted to, the end of the economy, or the telos of the economy, being giving especially families the material base they need to live a life of flourishing. You had one passage in your book that, even though I read this like 6 years ago, it's stuck with me since. So it's a little long, but our listeners of the podcast are used to me reading long quotes. So I'm going to read it, and then I want to talk about it a little bit. So you make this comment. You say, "It is an oddity of modern economics that it depends on treating the worker as just another commodity, labor, for purposes of pricing that labor, but treats the production cost of that commodity as something beyond the price system. If we take any other commodity, say a bar of pig iron, it is assumed that the price must cover the cost of production, maintenance, and depreciation, or the product will be withdrawn from the market. But in regards to labor, this assumption is never examined, for labor has its own production cost, the family, its own maintenance cost, things like healthcare, and its own depreciation cost, sickness and old age. Labor cannot simply be withdrawn from the market when these requirements are not met. Therefore, labor and the family do not even gain the dignity of a bar of pig iron in modern economic theory." And there's a few things that came to mind, or that have come to mind as I've thought about this. One is the question of externalities in our economic system, and how the actual price of something being put on market doesn't actually cover the real cost of it. And how, and this may have come from your book as well, that there's this idea that the laborer enters the market at age 18 or 16 or whatever, almost magically, as if it didn't cost anything for that person to be born and raised and educated and able to work at that age. And that the price of that laborer, their wage, doesn't factor in that cost, which is what you're saying here. But it reminded me of, in the church's social teaching, it talks about just wages a lot. And it talks about a family wage. In other words, a just wage is a wage sufficient for a family to live a decent life and to own property and to save for the future. But then the compendium of the social teaching of the church also says that a family wage is so important that even government subsidies are a way to support families. And it makes me think of President Biden's extended child tax credit from last year, which, my wife and I are our fifth child's due in a couple of months, so we benefited significantly from that child tax credit. But there were a lot of people in Catholic conservative circles who were pretty critical of that, at least in the discussions I had, saying that this was socialism, this was the government forcibly taking people's wealth and redistributing it. Mm-hmm. But in my mind, my thought was, if the market was actually paying just wages, we wouldn't need this government subsidy. So it seems like the market has chosen not to take up that responsibility, so now the state has to. I guess those are my thoughts. I'm going to throw that out to you and hear what you think.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, the welfare state is a necessity of a capitalist state, because a capitalist state has never generated enough purchasing power to clear its own markets. And that's why it was always necessary to inject money into the capitalist system for it to be able to function at all. So that's why in the 19th century, you get a business cycle, boom to bust, of 4 years. Actually, 3 years, 8 months, something like that. That's unacceptable to everybody. It's unacceptable to the capitalist, it's unacceptable to the laborer, it's unacceptable to the merchant. That's just too much uncertainty. And that kind of uncertainty has to be cured either by a just wage, well, that wasn't going to happen, or by the government injecting more and more money into it. And so whatever they may say in propaganda about hating socialism, they love socialism. They need socialism because it allows them to externalize the cost of labor.
Yeah.
See? And so if they can, if we can throw a cost of labor onto the government, then we don't have to pay them that much, Well, you can't throw too much on the government because then they could refuse to work, but you have to just pay them, you have to subsidize them just enough to keep them coming back.
So is there a sense where, Walmart and Amazon are everyone's favorite punching bag, so I'll just use them, very large employers who, at least, it's widely understood, underpay their employees, where almost factored in to their business model is the taxpayers picking up the tab for what they're not paying their employees. Is that an accurate way to think about this?
It is. I don't think it's consciously figured in, but it allows them to pay a lower rent wage.
Yeah.
So I'm not privy enough to the kind of high-level discussions they might be having, but it certainly works. That the more government support they get, the less wage support they need. Okay, and this is so terribly inefficient. If you have, for example, take education. Education should be freely available to everybody, but the best place to get an education for many, many people is at home. That's the most efficient means. Now, not everybody is capable of educating their own children. Not every parent is literate. Not every parent is skillful enough to do this, but certainly a lot are. But you can't do that in an economy that demands the work of women. It's just impossible. So you have to then have this school structure, very, very expensive, to take the place of something that could be done at home. Okay, it might not always be done at home, but it could be done at home. That's just one example of an externalized cost. And so capitalism, government grew, and Karl Polanyi points this out. The government expanded when the libertarians took control of government. Why? Because they needed this huge bureaucracy, information bureaucracy, and military bureaucracy, the British Navy, to make capitalism work. And so the libertarians come into office in 1832, government takes off like a rocket. So they're talking about smaller and smaller government, and the budgets keep growing, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's one of these historical ironies that people just refuse to see.
Yeah. It seems to me, and you just touched upon this, that another externality is how much of our modern economy needs the unpaid labor of domestic workers, of people to stay at home and take care of children and the elderly. Essentially, the people who take care of those who are not able to work, and we don't pay them. This was something when my wife and I were first starting to have a family, um, so we were living in Grand Rapids, so in an urban area, and the rent for our apartment was high enough, and our student loans were high enough that I made just enough at my full-time job. But if my wife Christina were to go to work, like the cost of childcare would have made it almost a wash. So we were put in a position where, like, I was making just enough to pay rent and not enough to save, and we were just stuck. But it was because we chose to have children young. So our experience has been that it seems that the system works against people who want to start families young.
Absolutely, and there's an excellent work. It's a bit out of date now, I think 20 years old, 15 or 20 years old. It may have been updated by, what's her name, the senator from Massachusetts. Oh gosh. Before she was a senator, though, she was a sociologist and an economist. And she wrote this excellent book called The Two-Income Trap. And basically the thesis of the book is that women's labor adds very, very little to family income. And she said it may add 17%. So between the expenses of childcare, the expenses of clothing, the expenses of transportation. So when I sold houses from the 60s had a one-car garage. Okay? Houses from the 70s always have a two-car garage because you need two cars now. All of these expenses that women's labor didn't add that much directly, but it did add something. It added expanded borrowing capacity, because what you could borrow is based on the gross income. You see, and family debt skyrocketed. All right, so they had greater borrowing capacity, and so family debt went through the roof. I think it ended up before the crash of 2008. It was something like 120% of income.
Wow.
I mean, it had been, since Second World War, it had kind of stabilized around against, I think, don't hold me to this too much, something like 40 to 50%. Okay, but it just went through the roof as women more and more entered the workforce. Whether you think that's a good idea, bad idea, that's not really the issue. The effect was clear on the family. The effect was clear on the workforces. Also, it lowered by the fact of doubling, in effect, the amount of labor available. It held men's wages flat.
Yep.
So there hasn't been, for non-supervisory hourly employees, the wage is about the same today as it was in 1973, adjusted for inflation. Maybe a little bit higher now, but not much.
And this is something that I've thought about a little bit, but haven't come to a conclusion yet. If our market refuses to pay a just wage, and if our market also does not compensate domestic work, then are we at a point where something like a universal basic income is the right way to go?
I think a UBI has a lot of merit. It has one structural flaw, however, because it runs smack dab against the law of rents. And the law of rents says that land will always absorb all income over the margin. So say you gave each family $10,000 a year. The law of rent says that after a few years, rents will rise by $10,000. So that's the structural flaw of the UBI. Now, that could be solved, but only by challenging the idea that private property gets whatever it can get on the market. So you'd have to have things like rent controls. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I grew up in rent control departments, so I've had some experience with it, and it was pretty good. I don't know that the country's ready for it, but if you're going to do UBI without rent control, I think you might have a problem.
Yeah, I mean, again, going back to about 10 years ago when my wife and I were first starting our family, we had, rent would go up every year, and we weren't able to really save anything. If it was not for my dad taking us in, like good millennials, we moved back in with my parents and lived with my dad for a year and a half, which allowed us to put all of our money into paying off our student loans, and then through a federal program was able to get a mortgage without a down payment. If it weren't for my dad and if it weren't for the federal government, we could still be renting today. It very much felt like quicksand or a trap that you could struggle as hard as you want, but you weren't getting out.
That's right. And that's, I think, that feeling, I think, explains most of the frustration you see in our politics today. People are flocking to Bernie Sanders or to Donald Trump precisely because they believe the game is rigged. And it doesn't matter that Trump can't do anything about it or Trump is part of the rigging, but he talks the talk.
Yep.
And so that frustration, they don't care what the truth is. They're angry, and they should be angry. They should be mad as hell. I wish they would choose a better answer, but nevertheless, you understand their it's easy to understand their frustration. Now, and the problem is this meritocracy. Well, Paul, I'll tell you what you should have done to get rich, okay? And I'll make this very, very simple, okay?
You're probably starting by not getting a theology degree.
Yeah, that's a real roadblock there. But before that, you should have chosen your parents better. Okay, if you had the good sense, and I don't know why you didn't do this, to choose rich parents, you would not have any of these problems. Now, at least you chose parents who at least could give you shelter for a time, and so. But think about the people who can't do that.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, Dominic. Is that Daniel Mitsui's work behind you?
You mean the artwork?
Yeah, the artwork. Is that Daniel Mitsui?
Oh, I have no idea. It's based off the Redwall fandom.
Oh, okay. I'm not seeing it clearly, but I thought that was a Mitsui.
Oh, it's not a stained glass or anything. It's a mouse in armor from a children's novel.
After John said, okay, yeah. Get back to the conversation. Anyway.
Yeah. I wanted to ask then, as kind of a wrap-up discussion, is what changes? Kind of a two-part question. What changes do you think need to be made for the economy to be more just, to privilege the common good and privilege families more, and practically, how do we do that?
Yeah. Well, the practical starts with, I think, a first rethinking what the purpose of an economy is, and rethinking how we measure it. So do we measure it quantitatively by GDP, or do we measure it qualitatively by making judgments about whether families are getting stronger or weaker, communities are getting stronger or weaker? That decision then leads to everything else. So the way then to make the family stronger is the same way that the rich get rich and the poor don't, and that is the property. The key is property. That is sharing of productive property in some way through co-ops, through UBI. UBI is actually a sharing of the benefits of property. worker ownerships. Europe's is using co-determination now, so that workers sit on the board of directors and help determine the direction of the company, and also minor things like wages. So all of these things to bridge the gap between capital and labor, and to produce this cooperative economy, either by actual co-ops, which, by the way, are an extremely efficient form of business organization, and spreading the benefits of ownership and the responsibilities for ownership throughout the society as widely as possible. And there's any number of practical ways to do that that are on the ground and working, and that we can actually look at.
How can I mean, to me, all of that sounds great, but I don't actually know what to do to make that happen as an individual.
As an individual, well, I think as an individual, do what you're doing. That is, talk to people, get to the root of the real problems, okay, and try to change the thinking of people, and try to change the thinking of people from this quantitative, individualistic, hedonistic society into a communal, and I would say happiness-based society.
Yeah.
Another thing, by the way, capitalism is based on happiness. And it's marketed to you 24/7. So if you turn on any commercial, and the commercials are the real message, never mind those shows. That's just to get you to watch the commercial. And the commercial tells you that you need all of these things to make you happy. And so my favorite, there's a number of examples I use in my class, but one of my favorite recent ones is the Subway sandwich commercial that they ran during, I think, the Sochi Olympics. And it was, they were blaring at you, okay, these messages of complete freedom. And complete freedom means being able to choose different toppings for your sandwich. But the message was, I do what the blank I like. How you could even get away with saying that on TV. They had blank in there, but how you could even, which is even stronger because it makes the hearer fill in the word. Okay? But that's the structure of every commercial you've ever seen. It's to tell you how unfree or how stupid or how unattractive you are, and you really need this product. So hedonism, we've got to destroy the hedonism, and we've got to have real pleasures rather than these pseudo pleasures. You know, I'm not opposed to pleasure. I like pleasure, but I don't know that it really comes from choosing my topping on a Subway
sandwich.
Yeah. Yeah,
I have greater ambitions, artistic ambitions than that.
Yeah, that was something that's something that I've really appreciated from Pope Francis. So like John Paul II used the terminology of a culture of death versus a culture of life, and Francis uses the language of throwaway culture. But it's this sense of, like he talks about social friendship, and in that, like, there's real meaning that comes in relationships, and that was something that he drew out in his encyclical, of like real meaning comes from relationships, not from individualism and material things, and actually what comes from individualism and hedonism is a throwaway culture, one that will just treat other people as things.
Well, it's a culture that measures its success by the height of the garbage dump. And along with the throwaway culture becomes throwaway people, throwaway friendship, throwaway marriages. So these are all just things that can be replaced when they no longer serve us, when the parts break.
In the last so many years, maybe the last decade, have you started to see how do you say, like a change of values or a change of focus? Like I keep hearing and I'll see how millennials are, quote, animated by different things. They want different things out of life. There's a lot of this anger, as you've pointed out, about how things are being voted and what people are choosing. But how do I say, do you feel people we're trying to tread water and keep continuing what has been happening, or are we cycling faster and faster because that's just what makes everything work? Or is there a shift happening, or is all this happening at the same time? It just depends on who you talk to.
The answer is all of the above.
Okay.
But I think that people are more receptive to the kind of message you're giving out now, because they're realizing this treadmill. At the same time, they're realizing they have to enter the treadmill. I'll give you the example is my women students. When I went to college in the 70s, and UD at that time was still a throwback to maybe the 60s or even the 50s, but all the women were, not all, but most of the women were married within a year and already had a child or were about to, okay? They stayed at home. All right. Now, I'm not advocating that's what women has to do. I'm just saying that's what it was. Now there's not a single student I have, not a single female student I have, who isn't looking to get a career in her own self-protection. And in this society, she's got to take care of herself. She cannot rely on finding the man who will, take care of that for us. And so the culture is strictly this individualism, this need to make a living on your own, and then you maybe form an alliance with somebody else. But and that's a profound social change. But I think people may be getting tired of it.
Well, like you pointed out, like Paul, like you said, millennials heading back and living with family and so on. I look at that and I have a hard time with people who have a hard time with that, partly because it's such a necessity for our lives, but also I see it being something so completely normal before the last 150 years, where, like John, you just mentioned, like everybody is now compelled to fight for themselves, as opposed to maybe finding a husband or finding a community or having your family. This sense of everybody starting from scratch in entering the workforce with no house, and it's a subscription-based economy for everything. And as soon as you stop running, everything is taken away from you. I mean, for me, this is just one of my intense frustrations with how First World West works. And then what I keep seeing with, there's so much TV that is produced and shows and so on, and they're all trying to be more and more, well, some of them, historically accurate, giving you these windows in how life was lived in other times. And I wonder if that's starting to have a more positive effect, because it's getting us to think outside of our own box and evaluate what's normal now with how things used to be. I'm really curious what's going to continue happening with this generation and then with the next.
Well, I think this idea of people moving back with their parents, and it's the language it's talked about in is it looking down on it, the kid in his parents' basement. But in fact, that should be normalized. I could only wish my children would move into my house and I could play with the grandchildren every day. That would be just great. And the idea then is so you get to my age, you sell the house and you move to Sun City, Arizona, so you can be surrounded by other people my age. Oh, hell, kill me now. Honestly, who wants that? But apparently a lot of people do. And so they want to be away from their children. They want to be away from any idea of community, because the communities were just suburbs anyway. And so, to put it in technical terms, who the hell cares? It's hard to get really emotional about your suburb. So, yeah, we need these intergenerational ties, because that's tradition. That's physical tradition, and the intellectual and the social and the religious tradition all really depend on material traditions, on physical traditions. So Grandpa's an old coot, but it's good to be around old coots. Old coots need love too. That's my motto.
Well, John, it's been great talking with you. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you think would be good to add?
Well, I think there's probably 100 things, but once again, the thing to emphasize over and over again is that it doesn't have to be this way. There are alternatives. There are alternatives in the past. There are alternatives in the present. Keep looking for different ways of living, of different ways of having community. They're there, and we can do it, and don't have to follow some clown who's promising what he can't deliver. He's not even promising anything, really. He's just expressing the frustration. We have to get beyond our frustrations and into real action.
I think that's a great place to end. Dominic, did you have anything?
I think, John, it's been an utter delight to meet you and listen to you. And where can people get a copy of your book, as Paul has been referencing this show?
Well, it's available at Amazon.com. I mean, what isn't? But toward a truly free market, it's meant to be an explication of Catholic social teaching in our current economic environment. So it's meant to be a useful book. Paul and you can tell me whether it really is, but that's certainly the purpose of the book.
Yeah, it was an excellent book.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Wonderful. Well, in the spirit of supporting others, we have someone who is supporting us, and we're collaborating with them to help support families in the Holy Land. This is the sponsor for this show, is Select International Tours. More Catholic leaders choose Select International Tours than any other pilgrimage company. With 35 years of award-winning travel planning, they have a track record of excellence and faithfulness. And they're a small company with a big heart, because every one of their pilgrimage trips helps to support and fund their 501c3 charity work, which is helping Christian families thrive in the Holy Land. So if you're ready to travel, or if you're looking to lead a group of your own, take the next step on your pilgrimage by visiting selectinternationaltours.com. Paul, anything you want to say about the Pope Francis Generation show?
Yeah, if you're interested in following this podcast and following my writing, please check out PopeFrancisGeneration.com. There
you go. Paul, you have paid memberships as well, and people get special access, don't you?
Yes, you know what? This is season 2 now, and so I'm a little rusty at this. Yes, if you become a paid subscriber, you can get access to our episodes early, and give us feedback on the podcast and recommend topics for us to discuss.
Fantastic. Alrighty, this show is brought to you by SmartCatholics.com. Come and join us. And thank you again for joining us in this conversation, for meeting John today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please hit that like button. It does help more people to hear about the show, to hear about John and his work. Maybe consider sharing this show with one friend you know who'd really like to hear it. And if you've got a question that you'd like us to respond to in the next episode, perhaps, or if you have some feedback for us, Paul, where can folk go?
You can go to PopeFrancisGeneration.com.
There you go. Until next time, please say a short prayer for us and for yourself. And remember, don't be afraid to ask questions. Doubts can be a sign that we want to know God better and more deeply. God bless.